There is a line in the ground in California that most people drive over without ever knowing it. It cuts through backyards, under highways, beneath vineyards and school parking lots. In some places, you can literally stand with 1 foot on one side of it and 1 foot on the other. And for the last few hundred years, it has been quietly storing up more energy than almost anything else on the continent. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what that line is capable of, why an entire town in California has spent decades waiting for an earthquake that keeps refusing to show up, and why some scientists say the real danger isn't the ground shaking at all. Let's get into it. A line you can walk across. Start in the middle of California, in a place called the Carrizo Plain. It's a wide, dry stretch of grassland a couple hours northwest of Los Angeles, and most people who drive past it have no idea what they're looking at. But if you know where to look, or if you've ever seen it from an airplane window, there's a scar running through the landscape that looks almost unnatural. A long, straight groove, cutting across hills and creek beds in a way water and wind never would. Streams that used to run straight suddenly bend sideways in a hard right angle, like something reached down and shoved them out of place. That's the San Andreas Fault. And the reason those streams bend is that something did shove them out of place, just not all at once. A little bit, year after year, for millions of years. The fault stretches for roughly 800 miles, from the Salton Sea near the Mexican border, up through the spine of California, out past San Francisco, and off the coast toward Mendocino in the north. It's not a single clean crack either. Zoom in and it turns into a tangled system of smaller faults branching off the main line, some of them capable of doing plenty of damage on their own. But the San Andreas itself is the big one, the boundary where two enormous pieces of the Earth's outer shell are grinding past each other. On one side sits the Pacific Plate, on the other, the North American Plate. The Pacific side is slowly creeping northwest. The North American side is drifting southeast, and Los Angeles and San Francisco are on different plates entirely, which means, technically, Los Angeles is inching its way towards San Francisco. Give it about 16 million years at the current pace, and the two cities will be sitting right next to each other. That pace is the part people underestimate. The plates only move against each other by around 1.5 inches a year. That's slower than your fingernails grow. It sounds harmless. It sounds like the kind of number you'd hear and immediately forget. Except that's exactly what makes it dangerous. The fault itself wasn't formally identified until 1895, when a geologist named Andrew Lawson mapped a small lake near San Francisco that sat directly in a linear valley carved by the same fracture. It wasn't until the massive 1906 earthquake, more than a decade later, that Lawson and other geologists realized this wasn't just a local feature near one lake. The same fault line ran for hundreds of miles beyond it, and the ground movement that had just leveled San Francisco had occurred along its entire length. In other words, the earthquake that made the fault famous is also the event that revealed how enormous it actually was. Because in most places, the fault doesn't move smoothly. The rock on either side is jammed together, locked by friction, refusing to slide. And while the surface stays still, the plates underneath keep pushing. Year after year, decade after decade, the stress keeps building in that locked patch of rock with nowhere to go. It's less like two plates gliding past each other and more like two people leaning against a door from opposite sides, neither one moving, both straining harder and harder. Eventually, something has to give, and when a locked section finally lets go, it doesn't release that stress an inch at a time. It releases decades, sometimes centuries, of stored motion in a matter of seconds. That's an earthquake. And the San Andreas has already shown more than once exactly what that looks like when it happens on the largest scale imaginable. The quake nobody talks about. If you ask most people to name a famous California earthquake, they'll say 1906, San Francisco. We'll get there. But almost 50 years earlier, in the dead of a January morning in 1857, Something happened on this fault that many seismologists consider even more violent, and almost nobody remembers it. It struck around 8:20 in the morning near a stretch of central California called Parkfield, and it didn't stay there. The rupture kept traveling, tearing through the ground toward the southeast for roughly 225 miles, all the way to a town called Wrightwood, northeast of Los Angeles. Witnesses said the shaking lasted somewhere between 1 and 3 minutes. Try to imagine that. Not the few seconds of a jolt. Minutes of the ground rolling beneath your feet. The physical scar it left behind is almost hard to believe. In a region called the Carrizo Plain, the same stretch of land with that strange scar visible from above, the ground on one side of the fault lurched sideways relative to the other side by up to 30 feet. Not up and down, sideways. Fence lines that had run straight for miles were suddenly offset, snapped apart, and shifted like they'd been sliced with a knife and dragged. A river changed course. At Fort Tejon, the outpost that gave the earthquake its name, people described the earth moving in visible waves, like ripples crossing the surface of a pond, except the pond was solid ground. Some accounts describe a low rumbling roar coming from the mountains just before the shaking began, so loud that people mistook it for a volcanic eruption tearing the hillside apart. And here is the detail that should genuinely stop you for a second. An earthquake capable of producing 30 feet of horizontal displacement, one of the largest ruptures ever documented on this fault, is estimated to have killed only 2 people. 2, not because the earthquake was gentle, it wasn't. It's considered comparable in size to, and by some measurements even larger than, the earthquake that would flatten San Francisco half a century later. The reason the death toll was so low is almost painfully simple. In 1857, this part of California barely had anyone living on it. A handful of ranches, a military outpost, a few scattered settlements. The land that violently ruptured that morning was mostly grazing country and open desert. That's not the case anymore. Today, that same stretch of fault runs within about 35 miles of downtown Los Angeles, a metropolitan area now home to more than 10 million people. The last time the southern half of the San Andreas broke like this was that morning in 1857. Trenching studies, where geologists literally dig into the earth to read the layered history of past ruptures like rings in a tree, suggest the typical gap between major earthquakes on this section runs somewhere in the range of 1.5 centuries to 2 centuries. We are well past 1.5 centuries since 1857. That single fact is the quiet, uncomfortable thread running underneath almost everything scientists say about this fault today. But to understand exactly what a repeat of 1857 would look like in a city instead of an empty grazing plain, you have to look at what happened less than 50 years later, when the same fault rattled a growing American city built almost entirely out of wood. When San Francisco burned. At 5:12 in the morning on April 18, 1906, San Francisco was a city of about 400,000 people, and most of them were still asleep. Then the northern half of the San Andreas Fault let go. The rupture tore along roughly 296 miles of the fault line, running from just south of the city all the way up past the Northern California coast. The shaking was violent enough to be felt from Oregon down to Los Angeles and as far inland as central Nevada. Estimates of the magnitude vary depending on the method, but the widely accepted figure sits around 7.9, an enormous release of energy by any measure. The earthquake itself lasted less than a minute. What came after lasted 3 days. Broken gas lines ignited within minutes of the shaking. With the city's water mains shattered by the same quake that started the fires, firefighters had almost nothing to fight them with. Over the following 3 days, more than 30 separate fires merged into a single unstoppable inferno that swept through roughly 500 city blocks. By the time it finally burned itself out, an estimated 28,000 buildings had been destroyed. Around 250,000 people, well over half the city's population, were left without homes, camping in parks and open squares while the US Army handed out supplies and tents. The official death toll recorded right after the disaster was around 700. For decades, that was the number history books repeated. But a researcher named Gladys Hansen spent years combing through burial records, missing person reports, and newspaper archives that the original count had simply missed or dismissed. And the number she arrived at was staggering by comparison: more than 3,000 dead. In 2005, nearly a century after the earthquake, the city of San Francisco officially revised its own historical record to reflect that higher figure. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If the true death toll from one of the most documented disasters in American history was undercounted by a factor of 4 for almost 100 years, how much do we actually know about the earthquakes that came before we had any records at all? There's a phrase seismologists use about the 1906 earthquake, and it isn't really about the shaking. It's about what the fire did once the shaking stopped. As one geologist who studies the fault has put it, the earthquake was the trigger, but the city essentially burned itself down afterward because the infrastructure meant to stop that from happening had been destroyed by the same event that started it. That distinction matters enormously for what a modern repeat would look like. Because 1906 didn't just teach scientists about the fault, it taught an entire discipline that the earthquake itself is often only the first domino. So if the fault has already produced something like this once, the obvious next question is whether it's simply a matter of time before it happens again. And to answer that, scientists didn't just study old earthquakes. They built an entire town-sized laboratory to try and catch the next one in the act. The town that waited 20 years for an earthquake. Parkfield, California has a population you could fit into a single school bus. It sits directly on top of the San Andreas Fault, and for most of its history, it would have been a completely forgettable dot on the map. Except for one thing. This specific stretch of the fault behaves in an oddly, almost suspiciously predictable way. Going back through the historical record, geologists found that moderate earthquakes of around magnitude 6 had struck this exact section of fault in 1857, 1881, 1901, 1922, 1934, and 1966. 6 earthquakes, and the average gap between them worked out to almost exactly 22 years. Not a rough pattern, an unusually tight, clock-like rhythm that almost no other section of the fault displays. In 1985, based on that pattern, the United States Geological Survey did something it had never officially done before. It published a public forecast stating that a magnitude 6 earthquake was likely to strike Parkfield sometime in the following 8 years, with a confidence level scientists described as 95%. This wasn't a guess thrown out for headlines. Entire teams of researchers descended on this tiny town. They buried instruments in the ground to measure the faintest movements of rock. They installed devices to detect changes in stress, in water pressure, in the electrical properties of the Earth itself, anything that might reveal some warning sign in the moments or months before a rupture. Parkfield became, without exaggeration, the single most heavily monitored patch of ground on the planet, all in anticipation of an earthquake that scientists were confident, for the first time in the history of the field, they could actually predict. The window came: 1985, 1988, 1990, 1993. Nothing happened. The predicted earthquake didn't arrive in the window. It didn't arrive for another decade after the window closed. Finally, on September 28, 2004, 11 years after the forecast had expired, a magnitude 6.0 earthquake struck Parkfield almost exactly where scientists said it would, just wildly, embarrassingly late. One researcher who lived through the entire saga described greeting the earthquake when it finally came with what he called a huge question mark hanging over everyone's head. More than a decade of waiting, all that instrumentation, all that confidence, and the fault still did whatever it wanted on its own schedule. The Parkfield experiment is often framed as a failure, And in the narrow sense of predicting an exact date, it was. But it revealed something far more important than a wrong prediction ever could. It proved that even a section of fault behaving with almost mechanical regularity for over a century can still refuse to be pinned down. If the most predictable, most studied, most heavily monitored stretch of the entire San Andreas Fault could dodge a scientific forecast for over a decade, it tells you everything about how much uncertainty is still baked into the rest of the fault, the parts nobody has been watching nearly as closely. And that uncertainty becomes a lot more unsettling once you understand that not every section of this fault behaves the same way. Some parts slip and slide almost gently. Other parts are locked so tightly that when they finally move, there's nothing gentle about it at all. 14 years before Parkfield finally caught its own earthquake, that difference played out in front of an audience of millions in real time on live television. The earthquake. The whole country watched live. On October 17, 1989, San Francisco and Oakland were doing something no other two cities in the country had ever done before, playing each other in the World Series. Game 3 was minutes from first pitch at Candlestick Park, cameras already rolling, when at 5:04 in the afternoon, the broadcast feed suddenly cut to black. A magnitude 6.9 earthquake had ruptured a stretch of the San Andreas Fault near Loma Prieta Peak in the Santa Cruz Mountains, roughly 60 miles south of the stadium. The shaking lasted somewhere between 10 and 15 seconds, and because it struck right at rush hour on a day when much of the Bay Area had left work early to watch the game, it likely changed who was on the roads and who wasn't in a way that ended up saving lives. Not everyone was spared. 42 people were crushed when a double-decked section of Interstate 880 in Oakland, known as the Cypress Street Viaduct, buckled and pancaked its upper deck directly onto the lower one. A section of the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge collapsed as well. In San Francisco's Marina District, buildings sitting on soft, loose fill soil sank and tilted as the ground underneath them briefly turned almost liquid, a process geologists call liquefaction. By the time the shaking and its aftermath were tallied, 63 people had died and nearly 3,800 were injured. For the broadcaster on air when the picture cut to black, the moment became, in his own words once the signal returned, the most dramatic open in the history of television. Millions of people across the country had just watched an earthquake happen live, without a single frame of footage showing the earthquake itself. What makes Loma Prieta such a strange case study isn't just the audience watching it unfold, it's where it happened. This wasn't a repeat of 1906. It ruptured a different, more southern stretch of the same fault system, one that had been quietly building its own stress for decades, and it moved with an unusual sideways and upward motion, rather than the clean horizontal slip the San Andreas is best known for. Which is exactly the point worth sitting with. This is a single-named fault, but it does not behave as one uniform threat. It has personality by location. One stretch might slip a little every single year and barely make headlines. Another might sit locked and silent for 2 centuries and then erase a city block in 15 seconds. And a third might buckle in a direction scientists don't fully anticipate, even while standing directly on top of it with instruments running. That variability is exactly why understanding the different sections of this fault matters so much, and why treating the entire 800 miles as a single evenly distributed risk would be a mistake. The sections that are locked and the ones that aren't. Not all 800 miles of the San Andreas Fault carry the same risk, and understanding why comes down to one simple idea. Some sections creep and some sections stick. Around the middle of the fault, near towns like Hollister, the two plates slide past each other in a slow, continuous, almost gentle motion. Walls, sidewalks, and building foundations built directly across this section have been documented, cracking and shifting by small amounts every single year, not from an earthquake, just from the fault quietly doing its job millimeter by millimeter. This is called the creeping section, and because the stress gets released constantly in tiny amounts, it almost never produces a large, violent earthquake. It just leaks the pressure out gradually instead of letting it build up. But on either side of that creeping section, north and south, the fault behaves completely differently. The rock is locked, the plates are jammed against each other, and instead of leaking stress out a little at a time, they store it. For decades, for centuries. The northern locked segment is the one responsible for 1906. It released its built-up stress in one enormous rupture, and because that release was so complete, seismologists generally consider this stretch to be at somewhat lower risk in the near term. It emptied its tank, so to speak, in spectacular fashion, and it hasn't had nearly as long to refill. The southern locked segment is a different story entirely. This is the stretch that ruptured back in 1857, the one running closest to Los Angeles, San Bernardino, and the entire sprawling inland region east of the city. And unlike the northern segment, this section has gone far longer without a major release than its own historical average would suggest it should. Geologists have a term for a fault segment that's overdue in this way, and it isn't dramatic language, it's simply describing math. If a section has ruptured every 150 to 200 years on average for as far back as the geologic record can be read, and it has now gone longer than that without breaking, the stress hasn't gone anywhere. It's still there, still accumulating, with nowhere to release except through the ground itself, eventually. This is the section researchers point to most often when they talk about what's usually called the big one. Not because it's guaranteed to happen on any particular date, earthquakes don't work that way, but because out of every stretch of the San Andreas Fault, this is the one carrying the heaviest, oldest, most overdue load of stored energy. It's worth being precise about what overdue actually means here, because it's easy to hear that word and picture a bomb sitting on a timer. It isn't that. It's closer to a savings account that keeps collecting interest with no withdrawal date attached. The longer it goes unclaimed, the larger the eventual payout, but nothing about the account itself dictates the day someone finally cashes it in. So what would actually happen if that load released? Scientists didn't just speculate about this. They spent years building out, in exhaustive detail, exactly what a rupture on this section would look like for the 10 million people living within reach of it. Building the disaster before it happens. In 2008, more than 300 scientists, engineers, and emergency planners collaborated on something called the Shakeout Scenario, a joint project between the United States Geological Survey and the California Geological Survey. The goal was to answer one question in as much detail as modern science allows. What happens if the southern San Andreas Fault ruptures in a major earthquake right now, today? They didn't guess. They modeled it. Geologists mapped exactly how much the ground would likely shift along this section based on decades of measurements. Seismologists then simulated how that shaking would ripple outward and amplify through the region's soil and bedrock. Engineers took those shaking maps and calculated, building by building, system by system, what would actually collapse, crack, or keep standing. Social scientists layered emergency response and economic impact on top of all of it. The scenario they built centered on a magnitude 7.8 earthquake, rupturing around 186 miles of the southern San Andreas, lasting roughly 55 seconds, a brutally long duration for intense shaking. For comparison, that's a release of energy roughly 5,000 times larger than a magnitude 5.4 quake that had rattled the same region earlier that same year. At least 10 million people would experience strong to violent shaking. The final estimate, around 1,800 deaths, roughly 50,000 injuries requiring emergency medical care, and something in the range of $200 billion in total economic loss. And here's the detail that tends to get lost in those big round numbers. The earthquake itself wasn't projected to be the deadliest part. Around 1,600 fires were expected to ignite in the immediate aftermath. The same broken gas line, broken water main problem that turned 1906 into a citywide inferno, except spread across a modern metropolitan region instead of one city. Those fires alone were projected to destroy the equivalent of over 130,000 homes and account for tens of billions of dollars in losses on their own. Building codes have genuinely improved since 1906. That's part of why the projected death toll, while still enormous, is nowhere near what raw population growth alone would suggest. Southern California has spent decades retrofitting older buildings, tightening construction standards, and studying exactly what failed in previous earthquakes, so it doesn't fail the same way twice. But codes only apply to what gets built after they exist. Older buildings, older bridges, and aging water and power systems remain vulnerable in ways that modern regulations can't retroactively fix. There's also the matter of what happens underground, quite literally. The scenario-modeled fault offsets of over 40 feet at points where the rupture crosses buried infrastructure, water aqueducts, gas pipelines, fiber optic cables, the kind of systems an entire region depends on without ever thinking about them. When a fault shifts that violently at a pipeline crossing, it isn't a matter of the pipe cracking. It's the ground on either side of the pipe moving in opposite directions at once. Water agencies and utility companies have spent years since the scenario was published reinforcing exactly these crossing points, aware that losing water service across a region already fighting fires would turn a bad situation into something closer to 1906 all over again. So the numbers aren't a worst-case fantasy, they're closer to a flaw. The outcome scientists consider likely given what we already know about the ground and the structures sitting on top of it. And once you understand the size of the disaster this fault is capable of, the far more urgent question becomes simple. How likely is it, really, and how soon? The math behind the weighting. Earthquake scientists will tell you almost every time that they cannot predict earthquakes. Not the date, not the week, sometimes not even the decade. What they can do is something different. Calculate probability based on everything measurable about a fault, how fast it's slipping, how long it's been locked, how big past ruptures have been, and turn that into odds. The same way an insurance actuary calculates the odds of a house fire without knowing which house or which night. The most comprehensive version of this calculation for California is called UCERF3, the Uniform California Earthquake Rupture Forecast, built by the USGS working alongside the California Geological Survey and university researchers across the state. It doesn't treat the San Andreas as one isolated line. It models the entire tangled web of faults across California as a connected system, because researchers realized that earthquakes don't always respect the boundaries scientists used to draw between separate faults. Sometimes a rupture on one fault triggers a rupture on the fault right next to it, turning what should have been a moderate earthquake into something dramatically larger. The headline number from that model. Across the state of California as a whole, the probability of at least one earthquake of magnitude 6.7 or greater within the next 30 years sits above 99%. For context, magnitude 6.7 is roughly the size of the 1994 earthquake that struck Northridge near Los Angeles, killing dozens of people and causing tens of billions of dollars in damage. And that quake didn't even occur on the San Andreas itself. It came from a smaller, previously unmapped fault buried underneath the city. Zoom into Southern California specifically, the region closest to the fault's most overdue segment, and the 30-year probability of a magnitude 6.7 or larger earthquake sits at around 93%. For the San Francisco Bay Area, it's around 72%. And buried inside that same model is a smaller number that matters more than any of the others. The chance of a magnitude 8 or larger earthquake on the scale of what a full rupture of the southern San Andreas could produce, somewhere in California within the next 30 years, was calculated at around 7%. That might sound small next to a number like 99%, until you remember it's describing an earthquake roughly on the scale of the shakeout scenario. 10 million people in the shaking zone, thousands of potential deaths, hundreds of billions in damage, and the model puts the odds of it happening in the next 3 decades at roughly 1 in 14. 1 in 14 is not nothing. It's not a certainty either. It sits in an uncomfortable middle ground, close enough to matter, distant enough that it's easy for an entire region to build its daily life around simply not thinking about it. Which brings up the question sitting behind the title of this video itself. With numbers like these, is it actually accurate to say this fault could end America? Or is that exaggerating something that, however serious, has a much more complicated real answer? Separating the myth from the fault. There's a persistent piece of pop culture folklore about the San Andreas Fault. The idea that a big enough earthquake could crack California off from the rest of the continent and drop it into the ocean. It's shown up in disaster movies, in casual jokes, in a genuine belief some people hold. It is not physically possible, and understanding why actually explains what this fault really is. The San Andreas is what geologists call a strike-slip fault. The two sides aren't pulling apart from each other, and they aren't colliding head-on either. They're sliding past each other horizontally, side by side, like two conveyor belts running in opposite directions right next to one another. There is no widening gap for California to fall into. There is no trench opening up beneath it. The ground shifts sideways, sometimes violently and suddenly, but sideways along a boundary, not downward into open water. So no, an earthquake on this fault will not sink the state, and it will not separate California from the rest of the country in any literal geographic sense. But the phrase in this video's title isn't only about geography, and there's a version of it that's genuinely worth taking seriously, not the ground splitting apart, but the systems built on top of it. Southern California and the Greater Bay Area aren't just population centers. Together, this stretch of coastline handles an enormous share of the country's shipping traffic through its ports, a significant portion of national agricultural production, and some of the most valuable technology, entertainment, and finance infrastructure in the world. The shakeout scenario didn't just estimate deaths and injuries, it modeled water systems, power grids, and transportation networks that, if crippled at the same time as buildings are collapsing and fires are spreading, could disrupt supply chains and economic activity far beyond California's own borders for months, not days. That's a very different kind of ending than the state splitting off into the Pacific. It's not a geological collapse. It's the kind of systemic disruption that ripples outward through an economy built on the assumption that these particular cities keep functioning normally. Container ships waiting on goods that never get unloaded because a port's cranes are damaged. Produce rotting in fields because the trucks that usually move it can't cross a collapsed overpass. Paychecks delayed because a regional bank's data center loses power for weeks instead of hours. None of that shows up in a death toll, and all of it was part of what the shakeout researchers tried to account for when they modeled the aftermath stretching for months rather than days. As one seismologist involved in disaster planning put it while describing the scenario, the earthquake itself is a hazard, but the damage it does to a society that hasn't prepared for it is a choice. That framing matters because it's also the most hopeful part of this entire story. Unlike the earthquake's timing, which no one controls, how ready the region is when it finally happens is something people actually can. What happens in the seconds before? There is one piece of technology built specifically around the idea that you cannot predict an earthquake, but you might be able to detect one just fast enough to matter. It's called Shake Alert, and the idea behind it is almost deceptively simple. When an earthquake begins, it releases two different kinds of seismic waves. The first kind, called P waves, travel fast but do relatively little damage. The second kind, called S waves, travel slower but carry the violent shaking that actually causes destruction. Because the fast, harmless waves always arrive before the slow, damaging ones, a network of sensors positioned near a fault can detect that very first signal and send out a warning before the dangerous shaking actually reaches a given location. The warning isn't measured in minutes. Depending on distance from the epicenter, it might only be a few seconds, sometimes closer to a minute for locations further away. But a few seconds is enough for automated systems to slow trains before they derail, to stop surgeries at a critical pause point, to open fire station doors before power fails and traps vehicles inside, and to give a person just enough time to drop, take cover, and hold on to something sturdy before the real shaking begins. It won't stop an earthquake from happening. Nothing will. But it represents a shift in how an entire region is choosing to face something it cannot prevent and cannot precisely schedule. Not by trying to guess the date, the way the Parkfield experiment once hoped to, but by getting faster and better at responding in the handful of seconds after the ground decides to move. The system relies on hundreds of seismic sensors buried along fault lines across California, Oregon, and Washington, constantly listening for that first faint signal. When enough of them agree an earthquake has actually started, rather than a false alarm from a passing truck or a minor tremor, an alert goes out automatically to phones, transit systems, and industrial equipment, all without a single person needing to make a judgment call in the moment. That automation matters because in a genuine emergency, the seconds it would take a human to confirm what's happening and manually issue a warning are seconds the system doesn't have to spare. It's a strange kind of insurance, built entirely around buying a few seconds and betting that a few seconds, used well, can be the difference between a derailed train and one that already stopped, between a surgeon mid-incision and one who paused half a second before the tremor reached the operating table. Because that, in the end, is really what this fault represents. Not a countdown to a single catastrophic date, but a permanent slow-motion negotiation between two pieces of the Earth's crust that have been grinding past each other for millions of years and will keep doing so for millions more, long after every building standing today has been replaced. The Carrizo Plain will keep sitting there, quietly holding the scar of the last time this fault let go in dramatic fashion. Parkfield will keep waiting, its instruments still listening for the next moderate rupture on its own strange, unpredictable schedule. And somewhere beneath the 10 million people living closest to its most overdue section, the stress that started building the day after 1857 keeps accumulating 1.5 inches a year, with absolutely no regard for anyone's plans, calendars, or comfort. What makes this particular fault so difficult to sit with isn't any single number from any single study. It's the combination of all of them at once. A rupture pattern overdue by decades. A city that once undercounted its own dead by a factor of 4. A prediction experiment that watched the single most monitored patch of ground on the planet defy its own confident forecast for over a decade. And a probability model that, however carefully built, can only ever speak in odds, never in dates. None of that adds up to a countdown. It adds up to something closer to a standing appointment nobody has been given a time for. One that the geologic record insists is coming, without a single piece of evidence anywhere in that record capable of saying exactly when. If there's one thing worth sitting with after everything you've just learned, it isn't fear. It's the strange fact that one of the most consequential lines on the entire continent runs quietly under parking lots, backyards, and hiking trails, doing its slow work completely out of sight until, eventually, it won't be quiet anymore. If you found this as fascinating as we did putting it together, hit like on this video and subscribe for more deep dives just like it.